The morning bell rang, echoing through the empty hallways of Lincoln High School. Students filed into their classrooms, dragging their feet, their faces drawn with the usual dread of another Monday. But inside room 204, things were different. There was an air of tension, something hanging just out of reach, waiting to break the surface. Mr. Reynolds walked into the classroom with his usual sense of purpose. The middle-aged teacher's crisply ironed shirt and tight-lipped frown were enough to send a ripple of unease through the students. He didn't care about pleasantries. He didn't care about kindness. All he cared about was his reputation, the one he had meticulously crafted through years of his career, one that was built on superiority and intimidation. "Quiet," he barked, his voice booming over the rustling of papers and murmurs of discontent. "This is a math class, not a social hour. You're here to learn something." The students fell silent, though a few exchanged glances, already tired of his sharp tone. James, sitting at the back of the room, hunched slightly in his chair, as he always did. He kept his eyes on the desk in front of him, trying to avoid drawing attention. He wasn't one for confrontation, especially with Mr. Reynolds, who seemed to take pleasure in picking on the quiet ones. James had always been different from the rest. His classmates called him shy, but he preferred the term quiet. He wasn't antisocial, just careful with his words. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it had the weight of careful thought behind it. But in Mr. Reynolds' eyes, this was weakness, and James had become his favorite target. "James!" Mr. Reynolds called, his voice a challenge, a taunt. "You think you're better than everyone else, don't you? Always sitting at the back, hiding away from everyone else. Maybe it's time you finally prove something." James could feel the blood rushing to his face, the heat creeping up his neck. The eyes of the class were suddenly on him, and the weight of their stares pressed against his chest like a vice. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He wasn't sure how to respond. The truth was, he didn't think he was better than anyone else. He just didn't fit in. But that didn't stop Mr. Reynolds from making him feel small, insignificant. Mr. Reynolds didn't wait for a response. With a smirk, he strode to the chalkboard at the front of the room, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote an equation on the board. It was long, complex, a jumbled mess of numbers, symbols, and fractions. James recognized the equation, but just barely. It wasn't something they'd studied in class. In fact, he doubted most of the students would have recognized it at all. But Mr. Reynolds didn't care about that. He just cared about the challenge. He cared about showing everyone that he was the one in control. "James," Mr. Reynolds said again, louder this time. "You're going to solve this. Right now. You think you're smarter than the rest of these kids? Well, show us." The room fell into a stunned silence. James couldn't move. His eyes darted to the equation on the board. His mind began to race. He had no idea how to solve it. The numbers were familiar, but the way they were arranged, it didn't make sense. It wasn't anything like the problems they'd been doing in class. But that was the thing about James. He had a knack for seeing patterns, for finding solutions even when everyone else was lost. He wasn't the best student by any means, but there was something about numbers that clicked in his brain, something that made them feel like a language he could almost understand. Mr. Reynolds was watching him now, his eyes cold and calculating. The rest of the class stared in quiet anticipation, their faces a mix of curiosity and disbelief. They had never seen James take the spotlight like this before. He wasn't a leader, not someone who spoke out, not someone who would challenge authority. But here he was, the center of attention, the subject of Mr. Reynolds' cruel little game. "Come on, James," Mr. Reynolds taunted. "Don't tell me you can't handle a little math. Or is that too much for you?" James' heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to shrink away, to disappear. But there was something else, something deeper. A feeling he hadn't experienced before, a quiet defiance. Mr. Reynolds didn't know who he was messing with. He didn't know what James was capable of. With a deep breath, James stood. He didn't look at the teacher. He didn't look at the class. He didn't even look at the board. Instead, he focused on the problem in his mind, trying to make sense of the chaos. He walked to the front of the room and picked up the chalk. His hands felt unsteady at first, but then something strange happened. The numbers began to shift in his mind, rearranging themselves, falling into place. It wasn't a conscious effort. It was like his brain was working on autopilot. He wrote the first few steps, then paused. The equation began to take shape in a way that felt natural, as if he were solving a puzzle, fitting the pieces together. It wasn't long before his mind was so absorbed in the process that he blocked out everything else: the taunting teacher, the silent classroom, the watching eyes. All that mattered was the math. As he continued to work, the equation seemed to unravel itself. The numbers aligned, the symbols clicked into place. Every move he made felt deliberate, each step leading him closer to the solution. It wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was something else, something James couldn't explain, but he knew it was real. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he stood back and looked at the board. The equation was solved. The answer was right there, clear and undeniable. A part of him wanted to shout out in triumph, but he didn't. He simply stared at the numbers, still in disbelief. It had been so simple, so effortless. Mr. Reynolds stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His eyes flicked from the board to James and back again. There was something unsettling in his gaze, a flicker of confusion. Then, it happened. Mr. Reynolds smiled. But it wasn't a smile of approval. It was a smile full of something darker, fear. "That's impossible," he muttered under his breath, his voice shaking slightly. This doesn't make sense." James blinked, unsure of what he was hearing. His heart skipped a beat. The tension in the room was palpable. The students were silent, their eyes darting back and forth between the teacher and James. Some looked impressed, some looked confused, but most were just waiting for the inevitable fallout. But nothing happened. Mr. Reynolds didn't yell. He didn't punish James. Instead, he stood there, staring at the board, as if he had seen a ghost. The whole room was suspended in an eerie stillness. Then, finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mr. Reynolds turned on his heel and walked to his desk without a word. He sat down, his eyes still fixed on the board, his hands gripping the edge of his desk. His earlier arrogance had completely evaporated. He was no longer the imposing figure he had been when he walked into the classroom. He was something else now, vulnerable, uncertain. The bell rang, signaling the end of the period. The students shuffled out in silence, their whispers filling the hallway, but none of them understood what had just happened. James stood in the classroom, his mind racing. He had solved the problem, but there was something off about the way it had all unfolded. The teacher's reaction was far too strange. It wasn't just disbelief. It was fear. And in that moment, James realized something he hadn't before. The numbers, the equations, they weren't just about math. They were a key to something bigger, something hidden beneath the surface. He didn't know what that something was yet, but he would find out. As he gathered his books and headed out the door, James knew that this was just the beginning. The bell rang, signaling the end of the class, but James didn't move. He was still standing at the board, his eyes locked on the equation he had just solved. It was as if the numbers were haunting him, their presence an unspoken challenge, their true meaning still out of reach. His mind raced with questions, but there were no answers. Why had Mr. Reynolds reacted the way he did? Why had he been so afraid? James shook his head, trying to push the thoughts aside. The students filtered out of the classroom, talking in hushed tones, their whispers buzzing in the air. James could feel their eyes on him as they passed by. He had never been the center of attention before, and now, he wished he could disappear into the shadows. He glanced back at the door as it closed behind the last of the students. The classroom was eerily silent. The only sound was the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. James stood there for a moment, frozen. His heart thudded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of confusion. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. James turned toward the desk, where Mr. Reynolds was still seated, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of his desk. His face was pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. He hadn't spoken a word since the moment James solved the equation, and that silence was suffocating. "Mr. Reynolds?" James's voice cracked, breaking the tension. Mr. Reynolds looked up, his gaze sharp and cold. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He simply stared at James, his eyes narrowed, calculating. It was as if he was trying to figure out if James was some sort of puzzle he hadn't quite solved. "You," Mr. Reynolds started, his voice low and almost hesitant. "You shouldn't have been able to do that." James blinked. "What do you mean?" "I've taught this class for years," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice gaining strength. "That equation, nobody should be able to solve it. At least, not without years of advanced training. You shouldn't have been able to do it. But you did. And I need to know why." James frowned. "I just solved it." "No," Mr. Reynolds said, shaking his head slowly. "You don't understand. This isn't a problem you should even comprehend. It's beyond your level. Beyond anyone's level." James took a step back, his thoughts swirling. He didn't know how to respond. The equation had felt natural to him, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. He had never been a genius when it came to schoolwork, but numbers always made sense to him. It was like a quiet voice in his head that guided him, like the numbers themselves were speaking to him. "I don't know why it happened," James admitted, his voice small. It just made sense." Mr. Reynolds's gaze softened for a moment, but only for a second. Then, his cold, calculating expression returned. He stood up slowly, and for the first time, James saw the faintest trace of something else in his teacher's eyes, a flicker of something that almost looked like fear. "You don't realize what you've done, do you?" Mr. Reynolds said, his voice almost a whisper. James shook his head. "I solved the equation. What's the big deal?" Mr. Reynolds took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving James. "The big deal is that you've just opened a door that shouldn't have been opened." James felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" Mr. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. He turned away, pacing in a tight circle, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. James stood frozen in place, his heart pounding. Every word that had come from his teacher's lips had only deepened the mystery. "I've taught this problem for years," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice now tight with tension. "And nobody has ever solved it. Not a single student, no matter how gifted, has ever cracked it. But you came in here, like any other student, and you solved it. And that means something. Something I'm not sure you understand." James's mind raced. "What are you talking about? It was just an equation." "I didn't." "No," Mr. Reynolds interrupted, spinning to face James. "It wasn't just an equation. This was an experiment. A test, of sorts. I didn't just give you that problem because it was part of the curriculum. I gave it to you for a reason. To see if anyone could do what you just did. And now," he stopped, his face hardening again. "Now you've proven something I wasn't ready to know." James swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" Mr. Reynolds took a step forward, lowering his voice so it was barely a whisper. "You're not just a student. You're a part of something much bigger. Something far more dangerous." The word sent a shiver through James's body. He opened his mouth to ask another question, but Mr. Reynolds held up a hand, stopping him. "You don't need to know everything right now," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice darkening. "But you'll find out soon enough. You're going to be a part of something that could change everything. And once you know, there's no going back." James felt his stomach twist. "What are you talking about? What do you mean by, change everything?" But before Mr. Reynolds could answer, the door to the classroom opened, and a voice called out from the hallway. "Mr. Reynolds? Are you in there?" Mr. Reynolds's expression snapped back to its usual cold demeanor, and he straightened quickly, smoothing his shirt. "Nothing for you to worry about, Miss Williams," he called out. "Just some administrative work. I'll be out in a minute." The voice on the other side of the door fell silent, but James could feel the tension in the air. Mr. Reynolds gave James one last, lingering look, something unreadable in his eyes, before turning and walking toward the door. "Get out of here," Mr. Reynolds ordered, his tone icy once more. "Go back to class. You've done enough for today." James didn't argue. He was too stunned, too confused to say anything. He turned and left the classroom quickly, feeling the weight of Mr. Reynolds's words pressing on his mind. As he walked down the hallway, he could hear snippets of conversation echoing from the classrooms he passed. Students talking about the latest gossip, teachers making last-minute preparations for lessons, but in his mind, none of that mattered. James's thoughts were consumed with what had just happened. What had Mr. Reynolds meant when he said that James had opened a door? What was it about that equation that was so important? And why had Mr. Reynolds reacted the way he had? His mind buzzed with questions, but one thought kept circling back to the forefront of his mind. Mr. Reynolds had said that James was a part of something bigger. Something dangerous. James didn't know what that something was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to find out. The next few days passed in a blur. James barely remembered anything that happened after the conversation with Mr. Reynolds. His mind was consumed by one thing, the equation. The impossible equation that he had solved without even trying. The equation that had sparked a reaction in Mr. Reynolds that James couldn't understand, couldn't shake. The bell rang at the end of first period, snapping James out of his thoughts. He gathered his books slowly, his gaze flickering toward the door. As he stepped out into the crowded hallway, he couldn't help but feel the weight of the eyes on him. It wasn't just the students that stared anymore. The teachers, too, seemed to be watching him with an unnerving intensity. It was subtle at first, passing glances, awkward silences when he entered a room, but it was growing. Something was off. He could feel it in the air. There was a buzz of tension that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He couldn't even escape it in the lunchroom. As he sat down with his usual group of friends, he noticed the whispers that ran through the room, the way people turned their heads when he walked past. The attention was almost suffocating. His mind raced as he tried to focus on something, anything, else. It wasn't until lunchtime that things took a turn. James had just picked up his tray and was making his way to his usual seat in the back corner of the cafeteria when someone called his name. "James! Over here!" He turned to see his best friend, Mark, waving him over from across the room. Mark had always been one of the few people who made James feel at ease, someone who didn't treat him like an outsider. James smiled faintly and made his way over. "What's up?" James asked, sitting down across from Mark. "Hey, man," Mark said, his face unusually serious. "You good?" James frowned, not understanding the question. "Yeah." "Why?" Mark lowered his voice, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "You're acting weird lately. You've been acting different. What's going on?" James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He wasn't sure how to answer. He couldn't exactly tell Mark about the conversation with Mr. Reynolds. He couldn't explain why everything felt so strange now, why he felt like something was just off. "I'm fine," James said, forcing a smile. "Just tired, I guess. Mark didn't seem convinced. I know you, man. You don't just act like this for no reason. Something's up. Is it that equation thing? James' heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? He asked, trying to sound casual. The whole school's talking about it, Mark said, his voice dropping even lower. People are saying you solved the uncrackable equation. Mr. Reynolds didn't look too happy about it either. I heard some people in the halls say that no one's ever solved that thing. So what's going on, man? What's the deal? James felt the familiar knot tighten in his stomach. I didn't do anything special. It just made sense. Mark raised an eyebrow. Made sense? That's a little too convenient. You're telling me you solved that thing without any prep, without breaking a sweat? You didn't even know it was coming? James hesitated. He didn't know what to say. He couldn't tell Mark about what Mr. Reynolds had said, the part about the door, about how James was part of something bigger. It sounded insane. It was insane. I don't know, James muttered, looking down at his food. I just did it. Mark leaned forward, eyes narrowed. You're not telling me everything. I don't know what's going on, but I can see it in your eyes. You're freaked out. You've been acting strange ever since that moment. And if something's up, I need you to tell me. James felt the weight of his friend's concern pressing down on him. Mark had always been there for him, but this was different. He wasn't sure if he was ready to share what he had learned, or even if he fully understood it himself. But as he looked at Mark, he realized that he couldn't keep this to himself much longer. I can't explain it, James finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Something happened when I solved that equation. Mr. Reynolds, he said I opened a door. He said that I'm part of something bigger now. I don't know what that means, but... Mark's eyes widened. Wait, what? What do you mean by part of something bigger? I don't know, James said, his voice shaking slightly. But I have this feeling that it's not just about the equation. It's something else. Something I don't understand. Mark sat back, his face a mix of disbelief and concern. James, you've got to be kidding me. This sounds insane. I know, James said, rubbing his temples. But everything's different now. I can feel it. Suddenly, a voice interrupted them. James, I need to speak with you. Both James and Mark turned to see Mr. Reynolds standing at the edge of the table, his face tight and unreadable. The sight of him made James' heart race. What now? He hadn't seen the teacher since the day he solved the equation, and he hadn't expected Mr. Reynolds to approach him in such a public setting. Mark shot James a questioning look, but James could only shrug. Sure, James said, standing up slowly. As he walked toward Mr. Reynolds, he could feel the eyes of the cafeteria on him. Students whispered behind their hands, and James felt like the entire room was watching him. He stopped in front of Mr. Reynolds, who motioned for him to follow. Not here, Mr. Reynolds said quietly, his eyes flicking toward the students at nearby tables. Come with me. James hesitated for a moment before following the teacher out of the cafeteria. They walked down the hallway, past the empty classrooms, until they reached the janitor's closet. Mr. Reynolds looked around once more to make sure no one was nearby, then opened the door, gesturing for James to step inside. I don't have much time. Mr. Reynolds said in a low voice, closing the door behind them. What I'm about to say is dangerous, and I need you to listen carefully. James felt a cold shiver crawl up his spine. What's going on? He asked, his voice shaky. You don't understand yet, James, Mr. Reynolds said, his tone harsh but urgent. That equation, it wasn't just a test. It wasn't even about math. It was about you. James blinked. About me? Yes, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice low. You've been chosen. You've been chosen for something bigger than yourself, something no one can explain. But it's dangerous, and there are people who will stop at nothing to make sure you don't uncover the truth. James's mind spun. He didn't know what to say. The idea that he was chosen for something that could get him into trouble, was terrifying. But it also felt like there was something more, something underneath it all, something he wasn't seeing. I don't understand, James said, his voice barely a whisper. What am I supposed to do? You need to trust me, Mr. Reynolds said, his eyes suddenly softer, almost pleading. There are people who will come for you. They'll try to silence you. And when they do, you won't be able to turn back. But you have to keep moving forward. You have to keep searching for the truth. James stood frozen, staring at his teacher. But I don't even know what's going on. I can't just. You have no choice, Mr. Reynolds interrupted, his voice harsh again. You've already started down this path. And now, it's too late to turn back. The teacher stepped closer, his face inches from James. You'll need to be prepared. Whatever happens next, you have to stay strong. The truth is closer than you think. But it's also more dangerous than you can imagine. Before James could respond, Mr. Reynolds grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. Go, Mr. Reynolds whispered. Now. And don't let anyone know what we've talked about. James's heart raced as he was shoved out of the janitor's closet and back into the hallway. He stood there, bewildered, his mind racing with questions. There was no turning back. The game had begun, and James was already in deeper than he ever could have imagined. The rest of the school day passed in a blur. Every moment felt stretched out, filled with whispers, nervous glances, and an overwhelming sense of dread. James couldn't focus on anything, couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Even though the halls were filled with students going about their daily routines, the weight of the secret he was carrying felt like an anchor around his neck. After school, as he walked to his car, James glanced over his shoulder repeatedly. He wasn't sure if it was paranoia or if something truly was following him. The words Mr. Reynolds had spoken to him in the janitor's closet kept playing over and over in his mind. You've been chosen. You have no choice now. Don't trust anyone. The next few days were no better. His normal routine, waking up early, heading to school, sitting in class, was now plagued by the ominous feeling that something was lurking just beyond his awareness. But it wasn't just paranoia. The whispers had gotten louder. Students, some of whom had never even spoken to him before, started watching him closely. Teachers gave him strange, sidelong glances, as if they knew something he didn't. It wasn't until Thursday morning that the first real sign of trouble appeared. James had just finished his first class and was walking to his locker when he spotted a figure standing at the end of the hallway. It was a man he didn't recognize, mid-30s, dressed in a black suit that seemed out of place in the casual atmosphere of high school. The man was watching James with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. James froze for a moment, staring back at the man. The stranger didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his eyes locked on James's. For a moment, everything around James seemed to blur, the noise of the hallway and the bustling students fading away. It was just him and the man, standing in the middle of a crowded high school hallway. Then, the man smiled. The smile was cold, predatory. It didn't reach his eyes. Without saying a word, the man turned and disappeared around the corner. James's heart raced. He didn't know what to make of it. Was he being paranoid? Or had the stranger been sent by whoever, or whatever, Mr. Reynolds had been warning him about? He didn't have time to process it further. As he turned to open his locker, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, half expecting another message from Mr. Reynolds, but it wasn't. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. We know what you've done. You can't hide. We're coming. The word sent a chill through James's body. Who was this? And what did they mean? Before he could respond or even comprehend what he had just read, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a voicemail. He didn't recognize the number. He clicked play. James, the voice on the other end was low and gravelly, with an edge of urgency. You've made a mistake. You've opened a door that shouldn't have been opened. It's not just Mr. Reynolds you need to worry about. There are others, people who know what you've done. They won't stop until they get what they need. You're in danger, kid. You need to get out of there. Don't trust anyone, especially not your teacher. The voicemail cut off abruptly. James stood there, staring at the screen, his hands shaking. He looked around the hallway, trying to make sense of everything. Who were these people? What was this door they were talking about? Before he could think too much about it, a figure appeared in front of him. It was Mr. Reynolds. His teacher's expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of urgency in his eyes that made James's stomach drop. James, Mr. Reynolds said in a low, tense voice. We need to talk. Now. James's heart hammered in his chest. I just got a message, he said, his voice tight. They know what I did. They're coming for me. Mr. Reynolds's face paled. I knew this would happen. You've attracted their attention. They won't stop until they get what they want. They'll come for you. They're already close. James felt his breath catch in his throat. What do you mean? Who are they? Mr. Reynolds glanced around quickly, making sure no one was listening. I can't explain everything right now. You need to trust me. They're part of an organization that's been monitoring certain people, people like you. And now that you've solved that equation, you've become a target. They'll use whatever means necessary to get what they need from you. What do they want? James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not about the equation, Mr. Reynolds said, his voice tinged with regret. It's about what you can do with that knowledge. What you can unlock. James stared at him, confusion and fear swirling inside him. What do you mean? I don't understand. What knowledge? There's more to that equation than you realize, Mr. Reynolds said, his tone urgent. It's a key. A key to something far more dangerous than you could ever imagine. I didn't mean for you to get involved in this, but now. Now you have no choice. Before James could ask another question, Mr. Reynolds turned abruptly and grabbed his arm, pulling him down the hallway. Where are we going? James asked, panic rising in his chest. To a safe place, Mr. Reynolds said, his grip tightening. We need to get you out of here before it's too late. James didn't have time to argue. As they rounded the corner, he noticed something strange. The man in the black suit, the one who had been watching him earlier, was standing at the end of the hallway again. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were two other figures beside him, both wearing dark suits and standing with the same unnerving stillness. They're here, Mr. Reynolds muttered under his breath. We need to move. Now. Before James could process what was happening, Mr. Reynolds yanked him into a nearby storage closet. The door slammed shut, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hall. James's heart was pounding in his chest. Who are they? Mr. Reynolds didn't answer immediately. His face was tight with fear, his breath coming in shallow gasps. They're part of the organization, he said finally. The people I told you about. They won't stop. They'll do whatever it takes to get to you. Suddenly, there was a sharp knock on the door. James froze, his pulse racing. Someone was outside. Mr. Reynolds, a voice called from the other side, we know you're in there. Open the door. This is your last warning. Mr. Reynolds's face tightened, but he didn't speak. The silence between them was deafening. James could feel the sweat beading on his forehead, his body tense and ready to flee at a moment's notice. His mind was a whirl of fear and confusion. What had he gotten himself into? Why was this happening? The knock came again, louder this time. "I don't have much time," Mr. Reynolds said, his voice low and urgent. "Listen to me, James. There are people who are willing to do anything to stop you. You have to go. You have to get out of here, now. They're coming for you." James opened his mouth to say something, but the door suddenly flew open, and the man in the black suit was standing there, his cold eyes locking onto James's. "It's time to go," the man said flatly, his voice emotionless. Before James could react, the man stepped forward, grabbing him by the arm and pulling him out of the closet. Mr. Reynolds tried to intervene, but the man in the suit shoved him aside with ease. "Let go of me!" James shouted, but the grip on his arm tightened, and he was dragged down the hallway. "Where are you taking me?" James demanded, struggling to break free. The man didn't answer. He just pulled James along, his footsteps steady and unwavering. James's mind raced, but he couldn't think straight. He didn't know who to trust anymore. Mr. Reynolds? The man in the black suit? He had no idea. As they turned the corner, James's heart dropped. The hallway was completely empty. The school felt eerily silent, as if all the life had been drained from it. And then, he saw it. At the far end of the hallway, the doors to the outside were wide open. It was a strange, unnatural stillness. A trap. His instincts screamed at him to run, but before he could act, the man in the black suit shoved him toward the door. "Go," he ordered coldly. The door swung open. And the last thing James saw before he was shoved into the unknown was the dark, looming shape of a black SUV parked just outside, its engine running. James's pulse raced as the man in the black suit shoved him toward the open door. The cold air outside hit him like a slap to the face, and for a split second, his mind tried to reject what was happening. He wasn't ready for this. He hadn't chosen this. But there was no turning back now. He had opened the door, and whatever was on the other side was rushing at him faster than he could comprehend. Before he could process what was happening, the man in the black suit pushed him forward. James stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the doorway. The SUV's engine hummed, steady and menacing, parked just outside the school entrance. Two other figures stood beside it, dressed in similar dark suits, their faces obscured by tinted sunglasses. The car's black paint reflected the dull light of the late afternoon sun, its sleek, ominous shape looming like a predator waiting to pounce. "You're not alone anymore," the man said, his grip tightening on James's arm as he steered him toward the vehicle. "And you don't have a choice in the matter." James's heart thudded in his chest. He opened his mouth to protest, but the man's hand on his arm was unyielding, pulling him closer to the waiting vehicle. The cold wind stung his skin, but it wasn't the chill that made him shiver. It was the unmistakable feeling of dread creeping down his spine. "Let me go!" James shouted, trying to wrench free. But the man's grip was like iron. Every time he struggled, the hold only tightened. The other figures by the car didn't move, but they didn't need to. Their presence was enough to signal that resistance would be futile. James's stomach twisted with fear. These people weren't just strangers, they were part of something bigger, something far darker than he had ever imagined. Mr. Reynolds's warnings echoed in his mind, they won't stop until they get what they want. Finally, they reached the SUV. The man in the black suit pushed the door open and roughly shoved James into the back seat. As he stumbled inside, the other two figures followed, taking seats on either side of him, their eyes never leaving him for a second. The door slammed shut, and James's breath caught in his throat. The man in the front seat, who was driving, didn't acknowledge James's presence. He kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his face expressionless. The SUV rumbled to life, and they began to move, leaving the school behind in a blur of flashing lights and passing buildings. The world outside seemed distant, fading away as the car sped down unfamiliar streets. James's mind raced, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Why had they come for him? What did they want? Who were these people, and why were they all connected to the equation he had solved? A million questions bombarded his thoughts, but the silence in the car was deafening. His captors didn't speak. They didn't look at him. They didn't even seem concerned by his frantic glances, his restless shifting in the seat. It wasn't until they reached the outskirts of town, where the buildings grew sparse and the roads became less traveled, that the man in the black suit beside James spoke. "You're going to learn things you didn't want to know," the man said, his voice low and smooth, almost like a whisper. "But you'll learn them all the same. You've already crossed the line, James. You've opened the door." James's throat went dry. He swallowed hard. "What door? What are you talking about?" The man's eyes flickered toward him for the first time, his gaze cold and emotionless. "The door to the truth. You've unlocked it, and now you're a part of it. And there's no going back." James shook his head, his mind spinning. "I don't understand. I didn't do anything special. I just solved a math problem. That's it." The man's lips twisted into a grim smile. That equation was never just a math problem. It was a test. A test to see if you were ready for what's next. "Ready for what?" James asked, his voice strained. "What's next? What's going on? Why are you doing this?" The man in the black suit didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced back at the driver. The other man in the front seat nodded once, then turned onto a narrow, winding road that led into the woods. The trees stood like dark sentinels, their twisted branches stretching out above them, creating a canopy that blocked out the light. "We're almost there," the man beside James said, his voice still low. "And when we arrive, you'll see what's really at stake." The minutes stretched on like hours. James tried to make sense of what was happening, but it felt like the more he thought, the less he understood. These people, they weren't just after the equation. No, it was something deeper, something far more important. And somehow, he was at the center of it. Finally, the SUV slowed, turning off the main road and driving down an even narrower path that disappeared into the trees. The air grew colder, and the sense of isolation pressed in on James like a weight. He looked out the window, but all he could see were trees, dark, thick trunks rising around them, blocking out any sign of the outside world. The car came to a stop, and the driver put it in park. Without a word, the man beside James opened the door and stepped out. The others followed suit, and James was pulled out of the car by the same iron grip, his legs unsteady beneath him. He was standing in front of a large, imposing building, old, with crumbling stone walls and tall, narrow windows. The kind of place that looked like it had been abandoned for years. But James knew better now. This wasn't just some forgotten building. It was something far more significant. It was where the truth would be revealed. The man who had been holding James's arm walked toward the building without a word, his pace steady, almost mechanical. The others flanked James, guiding him forward. There was no escape. He knew that now. The building loomed over him as they ascended the cracked stone steps. The heavy wooden doors creaked as they opened, revealing a dark, cavernous interior. James's breath hitched as he took in the sight before him. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of age. The floors were covered with an old, faded carpet that looked like it hadn't seen a vacuum in decades. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books, yellowed papers, and strange artifacts. In the far corner of the room, there was a large, rusted metal door, sealed with what looked like a combination lock. "What is this place?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is where it all began," the man beside him said. "This is where the answers lie." James was led to the center of the room, where a large table sat in the middle, covered in a map, some books, and a series of strange symbols that James couldn't recognize. The symbols looked familiar, but at the same time, foreign, alien, almost. The man who had been silent until now stepped forward. His face was stern, his eyes calculating as he studied James. "You're part of something much bigger than you realize, James. That equation you solved? It's not just a test. It's the key to understanding something that goes back hundreds of years." James's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" "There are those who have been searching for the truth for a long time," the man said, his voice growing colder. "The truth about an ancient power. And now, thanks to you, we've found the first piece of the puzzle." James felt his knees weaken. He couldn't breathe. Everything he thought he knew was crumbling. He had stumbled upon something he didn't understand, something far beyond his ability to comprehend. He had been trying to stay calm, to make sense of it all, but it was impossible. This wasn't just about solving equations anymore. This was about something ancient, something dangerous. "You're the key now, James," the man said, his eyes narrowing. "And you will help us unlock the rest." James took a step back, his breath shallow. "No. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this." The man's expression softened, but only slightly. "It doesn't matter what you want. This is bigger than any of us. And you're a part of it now." The rusted door in the back of the room creaked as it opened, revealing a narrow staircase leading downward into the darkness. James's stomach turned as he realized that there was no going back. Whatever this was, whatever he had unknowingly stepped into, it was more than just an equation. It was a doorway to something far greater, and far more dangerous. And now, he had no choice but to follow it. The air inside the abandoned building was thick with the smell of age, decay, and something more sinister. The sound of James's breathing was the only noise in the silence that stretched around him, as though the very walls of the place held their breath, waiting for something. He could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, the oppressive darkness of the room seemingly closing in with each step he took. The man in the black suit led him toward the narrow staircase at the back of the room. The door behind them creaked closed with a groan, cutting off the faint sunlight from the outside world, leaving only the harsh, yellow light from the few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling to guide them. The stairs were old and dusty, the wood groaning beneath their feet with every step they took. James felt the fear gnawing at him, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. What choice did he have? There was something in the pit of his stomach that told him, whether he wanted it or not, he had to go down this path. He had opened the door by solving that equation, and now there was no way to close it. The man in the suit led him down the stairs, and as they descended, the air grew colder. There was a strange, almost metallic scent in the air, like iron, mixed with something older, something deeper. James felt it in his bones, the realization that he was no longer walking into just a building, but into the heart of something ancient, something dangerous. Finally, they reached the bottom, and the man in the black suit motioned for James to stop. They were in a large, dimly lit room, filled with old machinery, rusted pipes, and strange symbols carved into the stone walls. There were tables lined with old books, papers, and maps, many of them yellowed with age. But what stood out most were the walls, covered in a maze of symbols, diagrams, and equations, all of which seemed to be connected by a central point. "Sit," the man said, his voice low and commanding. James glanced around the room, trying to make sense of the symbols. They looked like something out of a history book, some forgotten language or system of writing. But there was something oddly familiar about them, as if he had seen them before. The equations, the intricate designs, they were the same as the ones in the problem he had solved. Reluctantly, James sat at the table, feeling the weight of their eyes on him. The man in the suit didn't sit, instead standing by the wall, watching him closely. "Do you know what this place is?" the man asked, his voice carrying a strange edge. "What you're really a part of?" James swallowed hard, his throat dry. "No," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't." The man let out a quiet sigh, almost as if he had been expecting this response. This is the heart of everything, James. The place where it all began. The order. The secret society that has been tracking people like you for centuries. James's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean, people like me? The man's expression darkened. The gifted. The ones who are capable of solving equations, cracking codes, and understanding patterns that others cannot. There are few of you in the world, but you are essential. You are the key to something far bigger than you can imagine. James's mind reeled. The words didn't make sense. He had always been good with numbers, but that was it. He never considered himself special. He was just a kid who could make sense of things that others found confusing. But now, everything seemed to be shifting, his reality warping with every word the man spoke. You're telling me I'm part of some society? James asked, his voice thick with disbelief. I'm just a high school student. I'm not some chosen one. I didn't ask for any of this. The man stepped forward, his face hardening. You don't have a choice anymore. You never did. When you solved that equation, you activated something. You opened the door to a deeper understanding, one that was hidden for centuries. And now, there are people who will stop at nothing to get what you know. To control it. And to use it for their own gain. James felt the weight of those words settle on him like a stone. He had always assumed that the world worked a certain way, that problems had solutions, that there was order. But this? This was something else entirely. The man's words felt like a betrayal of everything he had ever known. Who are these people? James asked, his voice shaking. Who's after me? They are the ones who control the knowledge, the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. The ones who have been pulling the strings for centuries. They are the ones who have kept this knowledge hidden. The secret society known as the Order of the Vault. The Vault? James repeated, confused. What's that? The man's face was hard to read, but there was a glint of something in his eyes, anger, fear, determination. The vault is the key to everything. It is where the most dangerous knowledge is kept. Knowledge that has the power to change the course of history. It's hidden, buried away. But those who know how to access it can unlock unimaginable power. And that's where you come in. James's mind was spinning. He had thought that solving a math problem would lead to nothing more than a sense of accomplishment. Instead, it had dragged him into a world he didn't understand, a world that seemed to have no rules, no boundaries. You think I can just access this vault? James asked incredulously. How would I even? The man interrupted him. You've already done it. You opened the door. That equation you solved, it wasn't just a test. It was the first step. The key. Now, you must learn to control it. James's breath caught in his throat. Control it? I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. You'll learn, the man said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. But you're not the only one who has been chosen. Others like you have come before you. And just like them, you will be hunted. There are forces who will stop at nothing to see you fail, to keep you from discovering the truth. For the first time, the man's gaze softened, just for a moment, before it hardened again. But if you survive this, if you unlock the secrets that lie in the vault, you will become more than just a student. You will be the one to rewrite history. James didn't know what to say. The words seemed impossible, unreal. How could he, a high school student from a small town, possibly be at the center of something so huge? But the fear in the man's eyes, the urgency in his voice, it felt real. It felt like this was happening, whether James understood it or not. Why me? James asked, his voice a whisper. Why did I solve the equation? Why am I the one who has this knowledge? The man stared at him for a long moment before speaking. Because you were meant to. There are only a few who are born with the ability to access the patterns, the deeper meanings hidden in the world around us. And you are one of them. You are the one who will unlock what has been hidden for centuries. James's head was spinning. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. He had thought that the hardest thing in his life would be getting through school, solving tests, getting good grades. But now, he was standing on the precipice of something far darker, far more dangerous. And there was no turning back. "Do you understand now?" the man asked. "Do you understand what you've become a part of?" James looked at the symbols on the walls, the maps and books that littered the tables. They were all connected, somehow, to the equation he had solved, to the knowledge that was now locked inside him. He could feel the pressure building inside his chest, the realization that he had been thrust into something beyond his control. I think so," James said slowly. "But I still don't know what to do." The man in the suit nodded. "That's why you're here. You're going to learn. We'll teach you everything you need to know. But there's no time to waste. The order is already on its way. They'll stop at nothing to take what you know." James's stomach churned as he looked around the room. He was surrounded by people who knew things he didn't, things that could change the world. And he was caught in the middle of it, whether he liked it or not. "Let's begin," the man said, walking over to a nearby table and flipping open an ancient book. "You need to understand the basics first. And then, we can move on to the next step." James hesitated, but only for a moment. He was in this now. There was no going back. He stepped forward, bracing himself for what was to come. The door to the vault was just beginning to creak open, and James was about to step inside.